He loved 2 women, and believed he could control the truth forever. But secrets don't stay quiet when fear starts making decisions. What began as emotional betrayal slowly transformed into something far darker, something irreversible. Tonight, we examine how one choice, made to protect a lie, destroyed multiple lives, and revealed the real cost of silence. March 14, 2018. In the quiet hours before dawn, Marcus Hale's life appeared orderly, almost flawless. He woke at the same time every morning, brewed the same dark coffee, and read the same headlines before stepping into the role the world expected of him. To neighbors and colleagues, Marcus was dependable, composed, and principled. He listened more than he spoke, smiled at the right moments, and never allowed emotion to rise to the surface. But control, when practiced too long, begins to demand payment. Inside his carefully maintained home, Marcus moved with practiced precision, as if every object had been placed to support the story he told himself. A framed photograph sat on the hallway table, proof of stability and commitment. Yet even as he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his phone vibrated with a message he did not open. He already knew who it was from. He also knew he would answer later, when no one was watching. Marcus had learned to separate his days into compartments. One life belonged to routine, responsibility, and respectability. The other lived in stolen moments, late-night calls, and promises whispered in private. He convinced himself the two would never collide, that careful planning could keep desire from becoming disaster. At first, the secrecy thrilled him. It made him feel powerful, chosen, in control. Over time, that thrill faded, replaced by vigilance. He memorized alibis the way others memorized birthdays. He rehearsed conversations before they happened, trimming words that might invite questions. Every lie required another lie to support it, each one slightly heavier than the last. Still, Marcus believed the weight was manageable. He told himself no one was being hurt. He told himself he could stop whenever he wanted. The problem was that stopping would mean choosing. At home, warmth had begun to thin into silence. Conversations stayed on the surface, circling around practical matters while deeper needs went unspoken. Marcus noticed the pauses lingering longer than they should, the looks that searched his face for something he refused to offer. He responded with calm reassurance, never anger, never urgency. Calm had become his shield. Elsewhere, emotions burned brighter, more dangerously. Expectations grew with every promise made in secret. Marcus felt the pressure building, even as he insisted to himself that everything was under control. He ignored the tightness in his chest, the restless sleep, the sense that the walls of his life were inching closer together. The first crack appeared not as a confrontation, but as a feeling, a subtle awareness that the balance he relied on was fragile. That one unanswered message, one misplaced word, could unravel everything. Marcus did not yet understand that his greatest mistake was believing he had time. As the days moved forward, the lie he was living quietly began to demand something in return, setting the stage for choices that could no longer be undone. He pushed the thought aside and stepped back into his routine, unaware that someone else was beginning to notice the changes he worked so hard to hide. A question, once planted, rarely stays quiet. And as Marcus would soon learn, suspicion has a way of opening doors that were meant to remain closed. The next chapter begins where denial ends, inside a home already listening too closely to silence. Morning light crept through the curtains as Elena Hale moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to make noise. The house felt different lately, heavier somehow, as if it were holding its breath. She rinsed a mug at the sink and watched the reflection of the room ripple in the water, distorted but familiar. That was how her life felt now, recognizable yet subtly wrong. Marcus sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, his expression neutral. He always looked composed, even relaxed, but Elena had learned to read the spaces between his gestures. The way he angled the screen away, the way he paused before answering simple questions. None of it was enough to accuse him of anything, yet together it formed a pattern she could not ignore. They spoke about schedules, errands, and obligations, never about what sat uncomfortably between them. When Elena asked how his day would be, Marcus smiled and said it would be busy. He always said that. Busy had become a word that ended conversations instead of beginning them. She nodded, accepting the answer, though it gave her nothing. Elena remembered a time when silence felt easy. Now it felt deliberate. She sensed him measuring his words, choosing calm reassurance over honesty. When she reached for him, his affection was gentle but distant, as though he were performing intimacy instead of feeling it. He reassured her without addressing the questions he knew she would never ask out loud. Love complicated everything. Elena wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. She told herself she was imagining things, that stress explained the distance growing between them. Still, doubt crept in during quiet moments, especially at night, when Marcus turned away and sleep came too quickly for someone with nothing to hide. She began noticing small disruptions in routine. Late arrivals explained away without detail. Calls taken in other rooms. A phone that never left his side. Each detail alone meant nothing, but together they unsettled her. Elena felt foolish for watching so closely, yet unable to stop. Marcus, for his part, noticed her restraint and mistook it for trust. He offered comfort when she seemed withdrawn, framing her unease as exhaustion. His calm voice smoothed over tension, subtly guiding her back toward certainty. It was not cruelty but control, the quiet kind that convinces you your instincts are wrong. Elena considered asking directly, rehearsing the question in her mind. The fear of the answer stopped her. Once spoken, suspicion could not be taken back. So she waited, telling herself that proof mattered more than feelings. She needed something solid, something undeniable. As Marcus left for the day, he kissed her cheek and promised to call later. Elena watched him go, standing in the doorway long after his car disappeared. The house fell silent again, but now the silence felt alert, observant. She returned to the kitchen and noticed his phone charger still plugged into the wall. Empty. A small thing. An insignificant thing. Yet it lodged itself in her thoughts, refusing to let go. Elena did not yet know what she was looking for, only that something was missing. And once absence is noticed, it has a way of demanding attention, guiding the curious toward doors they were never meant to open. She cleaned the counter slowly, replaying past conversations, searching for missed signs. Doubt no longer felt intrusive. It felt necessary. Somewhere beneath routine and reassurance, a truth waited. Elena sensed that answers were close, and that asking the wrong question or the right one would change everything. Forever, irrevocably so. Marcus never thought of Renee as a mistake. That word implied carelessness, and everything about her had been intentional. Where his home life required restraint, Renee invited confession. Where silence ruled elsewhere, she asked questions and waited for real answers. He told himself this difference mattered. They met away from familiar streets, in places chosen for anonymity. Marcus framed these meetings as temporary, moments borrowed from a future he promised would arrive soon. Renee listened, believing she was hearing truth rather than fragments arranged for comfort. He shared stories carefully, omitting details that complicated the version of himself he wanted her to love. With Renee, Marcus appeared lighter, more open. He spoke of dissatisfaction, of feeling unseen, of a relationship that had grown stagnant. He never lied outright. Instead, he shaped reality by subtraction. The absence of certain facts made room for hope, and hope bound Renee to him more tightly than honesty ever could. Renee measured time by his arrivals and departures. Each promise carried weight, each delay came with reassurance. Marcus controlled the rhythm of their connection, deciding when answers were given and when questions had to wait. He framed secrecy as necessity, patience as proof of love. Over time, Renee began defending him even to herself. The power between them was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus held information like leverage, offering just enough to keep belief alive. He spoke of obstacles that could not yet be overcome, of careful planning required to avoid pain. Renee interpreted caution as care, not manipulation. She believed she was being protected. When doubts surfaced, Marcus met them with tenderness. He reminded her of shared moments, of words spoken late at night, of plans whispered like vows. He emphasized the uniqueness of their bond, reinforcing the idea that what they had was rare and worth waiting for. Renee wanted to be chosen. Marcus let her believe she already was. He never mentioned the questions forming at home, the silences growing heavier. Those belonged to another version of his life, sealed behind a door Renee could not see. In Marcus's mind, the separation remained intact because he needed it to. Control depended on distance. Renee began to ask for clarity, not confrontation, just direction. Her requests were gentle but persistent. Each time she asked, Marcus felt the walls narrowing. He responded with timelines that shifted, explanations that calmed but never resolved. He told himself this was kindness, that the truth would come later, but later kept moving. The secrecy that once felt thrilling now demanded constant attention. Marcus checked his phone obsessively, calculating responses, anticipating reactions. He was managing two narratives that could not coexist, adjusting one whenever the other threatened to surface. The effort was exhausting, but he believed exhaustion was preferable to exposure. Control was slipping fast, and with it his belief that careful planning alone could prevent consequences. Once emotion began demanding answers he could not give. Renee sensed the strain and mistook it for sacrifice. She leaned closer, offering support, unaware that her presence increased the risk Marcus feared most. The balance he relied on was slipping. Promises were no longer enough. Decisions loomed. As Marcus left another carefully chosen meeting place, he hesitated at the door, aware that he was standing between two lives with no clear exit. One door led back to routine and suspicion. The other opened toward expectation and demand. For the first time, Marcus understood that choosing neither was no longer an option, and that whatever came next would force him to protect one story by destroying the other. Marcus began to notice the pressure not in dramatic moments, but in the small failures of control. A call he missed while standing in the wrong room. A name spoken too quickly, then corrected. A pause that lasted half a second longer than it should have. Each slip felt louder than the last, echoing in his mind long after the moment passed. He replayed conversations obsessively, searching for signs he might have revealed too much. At night, sleep came in fragments. He woke convinced he had heard his phone vibrate, only to find it silent. When it did ring, his heart jumped before his hand moved. Every notification felt like a threat, every unanswered message a risk waiting to mature. Marcus had once believed truth was dangerous because it hurt people. Now he believed it was dangerous because it removed control. Confession no longer seemed like relief, but surrender. The idea of honesty triggered panic, a sense of collapse he could not afford. Lies at least allowed him to steer the outcome, or so he told himself. At home, Elena watched him carefully. Her questions remained casual, but her attention sharpened. Marcus sensed it and adjusted, offering affection before it was requested, explanations before suspicion could form. He monitored his tone, his timing, his expressions. Performing normalcy required more effort each day. With Renee, the pressure was different but equally suffocating. Her patience thinned, her questions grew more pointed. Marcus answered selectively, crafting reassurances that calmed her without committing him to action. He told himself he was buying time, though he no longer knew what he was waiting for. The future felt less like a plan and more like an approaching deadline. The strain began to affect his perception. Neutral comments sounded accusatory. Silence felt intentional. He imagined connections between unrelated events, weaving narratives of exposure that had not yet occurred. Paranoia sharpened his instincts but dulled his judgment. He reacted before thinking, spoke before planning, then spent hours repairing damage only he could see. In quiet moments, Marcus confronted a thought he refused to finish. That the problem was no longer the secret itself, but his inability to live without it. The lie had become structure, holding his world together even as it poisoned it. Removing it threatened collapse, yet maintaining it required constant sacrifice. He began to see truth as an enemy, something that waited patiently for weakness. This shift frightened him, though he disguised the fear as logic. He told himself people could not handle honesty, that protecting them justified deception. The justification repeated until it sounded like fact. One evening, a near discovery rattled him more than he admitted. A question asked too directly. An object out of place. Nothing definitive, but enough to confirm his fears were no longer imaginary. He smiled, deflected, survived the moment. Inside, something hardened. Marcus understood then that he was running out of options. The systems he built to manage his double life were failing under emotional weight. Control required escalation. Small lies no longer held. Larger ones loomed, heavier and riskier. As he stood alone, phone in hand, Marcus considered paths he had never allowed himself to imagine. Each one carried consequences he could not fully see, only sense. What frightened him most was not being discovered, but what he might do to prevent it. The pressure had reached its limit, and something within him was preparing to break, pushing him toward a choice that would redefine everything that followed. He lingered in that realization, breathing slowly, measuring risk like currency. Every decision felt transactional, every relationship reduced to cost and consequence. Somewhere between fear and calculation, Marcus felt a line shift. He told himself survival required decisiveness, not doubt. The thought did not calm him. It focused him, narrowing possibilities into something cold, deliberate, and dangerously appealing. Tomorrow promised confrontation or avoidance, or a step he had not named. Renee stopped waiting quietly. Her messages arrived with urgency now, no longer softened by patience or apology. When Marcus delayed responding, she asked why. When he changed plans, she asked when things would finally be different. The questions were not accusations, but they carried weight, and Marcus felt it immediately. He had promised clarity, and Renee was holding him to it. She spoke of shared futures, of choosing each other openly, of no more hidden corners. Marcus listened, nodding at the right moments, while calculating what each promise would cost him. Her certainty frightened him more than anger ever could. Control had always been his advantage. With Elena, he guided conversations away from danger. With Renee, he framed waiting as devotion. Now those techniques faltered. Renee was no longer satisfied with reassurances. She wanted action. Marcus realized that words alone could not stabilize two lives pulling in opposite directions. The possibility of losing control forced a darker clarity. Marcus began evaluating outcomes rather than emotions. He weighed exposure against containment, damage against permanence. The question shifted from whether he should tell the truth to whether the truth could be allowed to exist at all. Renee sensed his hesitation and pressed harder, unaware she was accelerating something dangerous. She asked for timelines, for decisions, for proof she mattered. Marcus responded with measured calm, but his mind raced ahead, searching for solutions that did not include confession. For the first time, he considered permanence as strategy. He replayed scenarios late into the night, isolating variables, imagining outcomes. What if Renee spoke up? What if Elena confronted him directly? Each possibility ended the same way, with his carefully constructed identity in ruins. The idea unsettled him, then hardened into resolve. Marcus told himself he was being pushed, that circumstances were forcing his hand. This belief made planning easier. If he was reacting, not choosing, responsibility felt distant. He began to think in terms of containment, of protecting the larger structure at any cost. Renee's voice lingered in his thoughts long after their last conversation ended. She spoke of love as certainty, as something that demanded action. Marcus no longer heard affection in her words, only risk. The relationship that once felt like escape now felt like exposure. By the end of the week, Marcus understood that delay was no longer neutral. Waiting increased danger. Doing nothing was itself a choice. Somewhere between fear and logic, a solution began to take shape, still undefined but undeniably present. He did not yet know what that solution would require, only that it demanded commitment and secrecy. The thought both repelled and steadied him. Marcus convinced himself that decisive action could preserve order, that one controlled move could prevent chaos from spreading. At home, he adjusted his demeanor, becoming attentive in ways that felt rehearsed. Elena noticed the effort but not the motive. Marcus interpreted her acceptance as proof that control was still possible. It encouraged him even as it deepened the lie. With Renee, he stalled carefully, offering just enough reassurance to keep her engaged. Each interaction felt like negotiation rather than intimacy. Marcus was no longer balancing two relationships, he was managing risk. The shift disturbed him less than it should have. Late one night, alone with his thoughts, Marcus acknowledged something he had avoided. If honesty destroyed his world, then honesty was the enemy. Protection required sacrifice, and sacrifice required resolve. The realization settled quietly, like a door closing. He did not act yet, but the direction was set. As pressure mounted, Marcus felt strangely calm, focused. Somewhere ahead waited a moment that would demand action, and he knew he would be ready. The next choice would not be emotional. It would be deliberate, final, and impossible to reverse. Marcus sensed that once taken, there would be no return to the life he pretended to control. That truth waited patiently, shaping everything that followed. Marcus sat alone in his car, engine running, hands clenched around the steering wheel as streetlights flickered across his face. The city slept, but his mind did not. Every scenario he had rehearsed for weeks converged in this moment, pressing against him like weight he could not lift. Confession would shatter everything. Concealment demanded something darker, something irreversible. He thought of Elena, waiting at home, trusting him as she always had, unaware of the secrets he carried. Her love had been patient, gentle, demanding nothing but honesty. A truth he could not give. He imagined her eyes searching for signs, her intuition circling closer to the truth with every passing day. That image tightened something in his chest. Then there was Renee, full of hope, expectation, and unshakable certainty that he had chosen her. Her faith in him was absolute, though it was built on fragments and omissions he had carefully curated. To lose her now, to let doubt infiltrate that bond, felt like failure, not just of relationships but of identity itself. The car interior felt claustrophobic. Marcus's phone vibrated again. A message from Renee. "We need to talk. Tonight. No more waiting." He stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen. He knew her call was both invitation and challenge. Answering meant facing demands he could not satisfy honestly. Ignoring it risked confrontation. He replayed their last meeting in his mind. Renee had asked for permanence, for commitment without conditions. He had smiled, deflected, promised patience. Now he realized promises were no longer enough. Words, rehearsed and precise, could not contain the tension mounting between lives he could no longer fully separate. Marcus imagined Elena arriving home early. What if she noticed something? An unfamiliar scent, a misplaced object, a hesitation in his manner. Each detail was a potential unraveling. In that instant, the calm he maintained in public and at home felt impossible to sustain. The walls between his two worlds were thinning. A voice in his mind whispered a dangerous solution. Containment. An act so decisive it would silence questions, prevent exposure, and preserve the narrative he had created. He recoiled at the thought, yet could not ignore its appeal. It promised certainty, the kind of control he had been chasing from the beginning. He rehearsed dialogue in his head, framing explanations, imagining defenses, justifying actions that would forever alter his life. He convinced himself the act would protect everyone, spare them pain, even preserve their love in some fractured form. Moral collapse was subtle, creeping in disguised as rational calculation. He told himself that survival demanded decisiveness, that hesitation was a greater threat than action. The street outside darkened further, shadows stretching across the dashboard. Marcus's reflection stared back at him, eyes hollowed by anxiety yet sharp with intent. He knew that the moment of decision would not offer choice forever. Once taken, the path forward would narrow to a single, irreversible line. The car's interior became a theater of imagination. He pictured confrontation with Elena, confrontation with Renee, confrontation with himself. Each scenario ended the same way: exposure, chaos, and loss unless he acted. That knowledge settled over him like fog, heavy and inevitable. His hands tightened on the wheel. The line between thought and deed blurred. Marcus understood that his life was balanced precariously on the edge of one choice. To confess was to surrender. To conceal was to act against his own conscience. But the alternative, letting chance decide, was no longer an option. He inhaled sharply, attempting to steady his racing thoughts. The night air pressed against the windows, carrying the distant hum of traffic, indifferent to the turmoil inside him. He imagined Elena asleep upstairs, unaware, dreaming of ordinary love. He imagined Renee waiting, hopeful and patient, believing he was on her side. And then he knew the moment to decide had arrived. One act could protect the story, preserve the facade, and maintain control. One act would also set in motion consequences he could not yet see. His rationalizations lined up like dominoes, each one pushing him closer, convincing him that action, not hesitation, was the only path. Marcus started the car. He did not yet move, but his mind had already departed. The streets around him became corridors of possibility, each turn a decision point, each pause a negotiation with fate. He told himself the next step would solve everything. The truth, he reasoned, would not. The engine idled in silence, and Marcus's reflection remained, split between fear and resolve. Outside, the night waited patiently, unaware that it would witness a choice that could never be undone. Somewhere ahead, an irreversible act waited for him. The first move had to be his. Tomorrow, or perhaps tonight, the lie would demand a cost. And Marcus knew that the moment before the fall was always the heaviest of all. The night was unusually still, the kind of silence that makes every creak and whisper feel amplified. Streetlights spilled pale rectangles across empty sidewalks, shadows stretching like fingers into the darkness. Marcus moved through the house with deliberate quiet, each step measured, rehearsed. Outside, the world slept, unaware that everything would shift before sunrise. He checked the locks 3 times, ensuring no one could intrude, and then returned to the room where everything had to end or begin. The phone buzzed once, twice, but he ignored it. Messages from Renee and missed notifications from Elena waited silently, unacknowledged. The weight of anticipation hung in the air like smoke. Time fractured. Marcus's thoughts raced, looping through past decisions, every half-truth, every omission, every carefully constructed lie. He imagined future conversations that would never happen, futures that would no longer exist. The consequences were clear in his mind, though the moment demanded detachment. He told himself emotion would be dangerous. Precision was required. A shadow moved across the wall, his own, stretched by a single lamp in the corner. He studied it as if observing someone else commit the act he was about to carry out. Fear thrummed beneath his ribs, yet he moved forward, each motion mechanical. Heartbeat, inhale, exhale, the rhythm was all that anchored him. The moments came in fragments, disjointed yet vivid. A door closing, a whispered name, a pause that felt eternal. Marcus convinced himself that control was still possible, that if he executed every motion perfectly, the world would remain intact. He did not pause to consider the permanence of what he was doing, only the necessity. Outside, distant traffic hummed like a slow metronome. Inside, the house seemed to shrink around him, walls pressing inward, breathing with him. He imagined Elena and Renee simultaneously, unaware, waiting, trusting. Their lives, their love, their certainty, everything hinged on this one act. In his mind, it was a shield. In reality, it was a precipice. Time bent. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. Marcus's own breathing became audible, ragged yet controlled. His mind catalogued every detail, the placement of furniture, the trajectory of sound, the angle of shadows. Everything mattered, yet nothing could truly prepare him for the aftershock. Then it happened. The act was over before he fully processed it, a decision executed with the cold efficiency of someone convinced it was necessary. Silence followed immediately, thick and heavy, pressing against his ears. For a moment Marcus expected relief. Instead, panic rose in its place. The air felt charged, electric, as if the house itself were aware that the equilibrium had been broken. He stood frozen, the enormity of what he had done settling like a stone in his chest. Outside, the night remained indifferent. Inside, every breath, every heartbeat, every memory replayed in relentless loop. Marcus realized that while he had believed he was protecting a secret, he had also set in motion consequences beyond calculation. The quiet was not peace. It was alert, waiting. Marcus moved through the house, checking locks, closing blinds, adjusting lights. Gestures of someone who hoped control could be restored. Every sound startled him. Every creak suggested discovery. Every shadow could be a witness. His own hands felt alien, instruments of a choice that now defined him. He sank into a chair, shaking, but unable to rest. Thoughts collided. Renee, Elena, the life he had carefully curated. All now vulnerable to exposure, suspicion, or accident. The realization that the secret would not remain hidden forever clawed at him. Nothing could return to the order he once maintained. Hours passed in fractured perception. The night outside moved toward dawn, but Marcus did not notice. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing with each flash of memory, each imagined confrontation, each imagined scream. Sleep was impossible. Rest was forbidden. The weight of the act pressed in from all sides. And then the first subtle signs of unraveling appeared. A mist sound downstairs, a faint creak above. The realization that others were already moving in ways he could not predict. Marcus understood with a cold, sinking certainty that the moment of action had not ended the story. It had only begun a far more dangerous chapter. The night that was meant to seal the secret forever had done the opposite. Silence lingered, but it was no longer a haven. It was a warning, and Marcus, alone and trembling, recognized for the first time that he was trapped, not by law or morality, but by the consequences of his own hands. The world outside the windows had not changed. The world inside him never would. By the time dawn crept into the sky, Marcus was no longer certain what was real or imagined. Shadows shifted differently now, sounds were sharper, and the house felt alive with memory and expectation. He had acted decisively, but the price had only just begun to arrive. The next chapter would not offer calm, only exposure, doubt, and the relentless pressure of truth creeping closer. Morning arrived slowly, reluctant, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate the house. Marcus moved through his routine with mechanical precision, making coffee, opening blinds, glancing at his reflection in the mirror. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. The act of last night lingered in the corners of his mind, a shadow he could not shake. Elena sensed it first in the small inconsistencies. A hesitation in his voice, a pause too long before answering, eyes that darted away instead of meeting hers. Something in his energy had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. She could not name it, could not define it, yet the tension pressed on her chest like invisible hands. Marcus rehearsed normalcy, muting the tremor in his thoughts. Every word was measured, every gesture curated to avoid suspicion. He smiled at Elena when she asked about his night, offered warmth where distance might have leaked. But each attempt at composure required immense effort. Every glance at her face triggered memory, fear, and calculation simultaneously. Sleep had become a stranger. The night replayed endlessly in his mind, each detail sharpened, each sound exaggerated. He imagined moments he had not fully noticed, connections he might have missed. The silence of the house no longer felt safe. It was a mirror, reflecting the act he could not undo. Guilt coiled around his thoughts, whispering with every tick of the clock. Elena moved through her own routines cautiously. She noticed misaligned items, the faint scent of something unfamiliar, the subtle weight of avoidance in conversation. Her intuition told her something far darker than betrayal had taken root, though she had no proof. Doubt became a companion she could not escape, forcing attention to detail that once seemed trivial. Marcus became hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every shift in tone. He cataloged Elena's movements, interpreted Renee's messages in meticulous detail, and replayed every interaction through multiple lenses. Every misstep could trigger discovery. Every slip could undo the fragile control he clung to. Anxiety had become constant, insomnia inevitable. He began speaking aloud to himself when alone, rehearsing conversations, imagining confrontations, convincing himself of rational explanations. Yet rationality did little to soothe the storm inside. Panic coexisted with calculation. He moved through the house like a man balancing on glass, each step careful, deliberate, exhausted. Meals were prepared and consumed with meticulous care, yet tasted of nothing. Every routine interaction with Elena became a minefield, each smile and gesture layered with tension. The quiet seemed louder than it had ever been, filled with unseen expectation, waiting for him to falter. At night, he returned to the room where last night's decision had taken form. He traced the lines of the walls, replayed the sounds, examined shadows. Sleep refused him. Every imagined movement of Elena or Renee sharpened the edges of his fear. His reflection in the darkened window was a stranger, eyes hollowed by obsession and dread. Elena began to observe him more closely, though without suspicion she could articulate. Small things, the way his hands trembled, the rapidity of his glances at the clock, the occasional vacant stare, hinted at secrets he would never share. Her unease grew with each passing day, building pressure that neither could confront directly. Marcus understood he could not undo what had happened. Each day without exposure was both relief and torment. He survived, yet survival felt heavier than the act itself. The weight of the secret compressed reality, reshaping the rhythm of life into something fragile, tense, and unrecognizable. By evening, Marcus found himself alone again, staring at the dim room, replaying the moments in precise sequence. The aftermath had begun its slow work, eroding his composure, amplifying paranoia, and embedding guilt into every thought. He realized that the consequences of his action were not immediate, not visible, but inescapable, threading through every interaction, every breath, every fleeting glance. Life moved forward, but it had no warmth, no certainty. Marcus and Elena existed in parallel, tethered by love yet separated by a shadow neither could name. The tension was a living thing, and Marcus felt its presence with every heartbeat, a constant reminder that the act meant to protect had changed everything. The pressure would only increase, and the cracks in control were beginning to widen, hinting at confrontation yet to come. The smallest things began to unravel Marcus's carefully constructed reality. A word misplaced, a glance held too long, a hesitation he had not rehearsed. All became magnified in his mind, pieces of a puzzle threatening to reveal the whole. Every interaction with Elena or Renee was filtered through suspicion, each pause loaded with imagined accusation. The mask of control he had relied on for months showed the first signs of fracture. He replayed past conversations obsessively. Words spoken casually now carried hidden meaning. Gestures once dismissed as neutral seemed calculated. Every memory became a potential clue, every smile or sigh an alarm. Marcus recognized patterns he had ignored, moments where instinct had whispered truth and he had silenced it with logic. The weight of accumulated deception pressed down, relentless and suffocating. At home, Elena's behavior shifted subtly. She asked questions indirectly, tested responses with phrasing that seemed innocuous, yet carried the weight of scrutiny. Marcus noticed the pattern, saw the intelligence behind her quiet observations. Fear replaced confidence in him, a persistent undercurrent that tugged at every thought. He could no longer rely on charm or routine. Every word risked exposure. With Renee, the cracks appeared differently but just as dangerously. Messages arrived with expectation, tone sharpened by impatience and hope. Marcus felt the pressure in each syllable, aware that any misstep could unravel months of carefully maintained narrative. Lies required constant adjustment, and each correction left a residue of tension he could not ignore. His mind shifted between past and present, a constant editing of events. The story he told himself clashed with what actually occurred, each version demanding attention and justification. He considered moments he might have acted differently, calculated where the narrative could survive deviation, and where it would collapse. The lies were multiplying, and with each addition, truth grew louder. In quiet moments, Marcus imagined exposure in vivid detail. Elena discovering the truth on her own, Renee realizing the facade, his own reflection acknowledging the moral cost. Anxiety spiraled, a physical sensation pressing against his chest, tightening with each passing hour. Control, once comforting, now seemed fragile and fleeting. Even the mundane became threatening. A misplaced phone, an overlooked receipt, a passing look between neighbors. All were potential proof, evidence of the dual life he had created. Marcus cataloged them, analyzed them, rehearsed explanations that might never be needed. Yet the rehearsal alone was exhausting, fraying patience and clarity. He began to question his own memories, unsure whether events unfolded as he remembered or as he wished them to. Trust in his own perception faltered. Every recollection was filtered through fear, every certainty shadowed by doubt. The narrative he had meticulously built felt less like reality and more like a house of cards, each lie another risk of collapse. At night, sleep became impossible. Thoughts replayed endlessly, branching into permutations of disaster. Marcus saw himself failing both women, failing himself. The mask he had worn to appear composed and controlled began to feel like a cage, holding him in place while the truth crept closer, inevitable and merciless. By the end of each day, he understood that survival required more than planning. It required constant vigilance, intuition sharpened to a painful edge. The cracks in his mask widened, threatening to reveal the complexity of his deception. He knew the truth was no longer distant. It had drawn near, patient and unforgiving. Marcus moved through his home and his life acutely aware of the fragile tension around him. Every interaction, every word, every glance carried consequence. The illusion of mastery had faltered, replaced by a gnawing certainty that exposure was near. The stakes had grown too high, and the careful balance he had relied upon teetered dangerously, pointing toward confrontation he could no longer avoid. The next chapter would confront the consequences of these accumulated cracks, as the pressure he had long avoided finally demanded resolution. The walls that Marcus had built around his life began to crumble, not with a crash but with persistent, unrelenting pressure. Small inconsistencies, once invisible or ignorable, now demanded attention. A misplaced note, a question phrased differently, a lingering glance. Each one chipped away at his control, eroding the narrative he had clung to for so long. Elena's presence had shifted. She no longer asked direct questions but observed him closely, every gesture and pause magnified in her mind. Marcus felt her attention like a weight pressing from across the room. He tried to smile, to offer calm reassurance, but the effort faltered halfway, his composure cracking under the strain. Renee, too, was advancing in her expectations. Her messages were precise, almost interrogative. Each inquiry carried implicit demands, subtly probing the boundaries he had worked so hard to maintain. Marcus replayed their interactions in his mind, dissecting phrases, weighing reactions, searching for any hint that might be used against him. Fear replaced strategy, anxiety replaced confidence. Alone, Marcus confronted himself with questions he could no longer avoid. Had he misjudged patience? Had he miscalculated control? The answers were terrifying. The foundations of his life were no longer under his guidance. Every justification he had rehearsed, protection, love, necessity, felt brittle and hollow under the weight of reality. The psychological strain manifested physically. He shook while making coffee, his hands trembled while adjusting blinds. Heart racing, breath uneven, he moved through the house like someone navigating a minefield. Each sound became a potential threat, each shadow a witness. The mind, he realized, could create consequences more precise and relentless than any outside force. Elena's presence became unavoidable, her silence speaking volumes. Marcus imagined the confrontation he feared most, the questions she would ask if she ever discovered the missing pieces. He rehearsed every answer, yet none felt adequate. The realization settled like lead. Lies demanded constant maintenance, and his capacity to maintain them had faltered. Renee's insistence added to the pressure. Her voice, whether on the phone or in messages, seemed to echo inside his head, reminding him of obligations he could no longer meet without exposure. Marcus felt cornered, the duality of his life collapsing inward, threatening to reveal everything he had worked to hide. In his mind, the crime he had committed became both shield and cage. It was supposed to protect, but now it trapped him in an endless cycle of fear, anticipation, and guilt. He confronted the reality that actions meant to preserve control often invite scrutiny, that secrets rarely remain hidden, and that consequences have a way of arriving unannounced and unavoidable. Dialogue with himself grew intense. Questions he could not answer demanded response. Why did you think this would work? Why did you believe anyone would remain blind? How do you repair what has been broken? Each internal interrogation left him more hollow, more aware of the moral and emotional cost of his choices. Regret surfaced, sharp and undeniable. It was not just for the act itself, but for every lie, every manipulation, every moment he had believed he could steer the world by controlling information. Marcus understood that accountability does not require witnesses. The mind holds memory, judgment, and consequence in equal measure. By evening, the house felt alien, every corner a mirror of his conscience. No reassurance, no repetition of careful motions, no strategy could restore what had been lost. Marcus confronted a truth he had long resisted. Control had been an illusion, secrecy a fragile shield, and now exposure, whether imminent or imagined, demanded reckoning. The day ended without confrontation, yet Marcus was exhausted in a way that sleep could not repair. He sat alone, replaying interactions, cataloging missteps, and measuring the cost of each decision. The cracks he had ignored were now fissures wide enough to let reality seep in. His justifications had crumbled, leaving only regret and the certainty of consequence. By nightfall, Marcus realized that secrets, once wielded as tools, have a way of turning on their keepers. The next chapter would show how survival, guilt, and revelation intersect, forcing choices and consequences to collide in ways he could no longer avoid. Silence had a weight Marcus could no longer ignore. The absence of confrontation, the quiet that once felt like protection, now pressed in from every direction. Every glance, every word unsaid, every omission compounded the damage. The cost of what he had done, and what he had hidden long before the act itself, was becoming unmistakable, inescapable, and permanent. Elena moved through the house differently now, her presence quiet but watchful. She did not speak of suspicion, did not demand explanations, but the atmosphere between them carried tension so thick it became tangible. Marcus could feel the weight of every unspoken thought, every unasked question, and he realized that silence had consequences beyond immediate discovery. It eroded trust, reshaped relationships, and created distance that could never be fully repaired. Renee, too, felt the cost, though she could not yet name it. Hope remained, but it had been tempered by patience that was no longer blind. Each interaction carried the invisible history Marcus could not escape. The promises, the manipulations, the delicate balance, all now contributed to a reality that neither could control. The emotional currency he had relied upon had depleted, leaving only expectation and strain. Marcus reflected on the cascade of choices that had led to this point. One lie begot another, each a step toward inevitability. He saw how his actions, initially rationalized as necessary, had compounded into a web of moral failure that could not be disentangled. The act he had committed to protect a secret had, paradoxically, ensured its influence would never fade. Every relationship, every decision, every moment of deception carried permanent ramifications. He understood, with a clarity he had long avoided, that protection through silence demands a cost. Secrets do not vanish. They linger, infiltrate, and shape the lives of everyone involved. Attempting to preserve appearances by concealing the truth exacts a toll that is measured not just in guilt, but in lost trust, fractured love, and altered futures. Marcus saw it in the way Elena avoided certain topics, in Renee's cautious optimism, in his own relentless anxiety. The night outside mirrored the quiet inside. Marcus sat in a dimly lit room, replaying each interaction, each choice, each justification. Reflection offered no absolution, only understanding. The illusion of control had ended. The consequences were absolute. He realized that responsibility is not only the acknowledgement of acts, but the vigilance required to prevent harm before it occurs, and he had failed in every measure. The house, once a sanctuary of order and routine, now felt like a gallery of mistakes. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every memory was tinged with the knowledge that lives had been altered irrevocably. The damage was not confined to the night of the crime. It extended backward, tracing every deception that allowed that night to happen, every manipulation that had concealed truth until it was too late to reverse. Marcus understood that moral failure carries a cumulative effect. It begins with small choices, denial, evasion, minor omissions, and escalates to acts whose consequences cannot be contained. The realization was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was steady, relentless, and devastating. Each moment of silence, each half-truth, each act of concealment had contributed to the current fracture, and there was no path back. By dawn, Marcus recognized the permanence of the cost. The lives around him had shifted in ways he could not repair. The trust once freely given was now cautious, tentative, or absent. The illusion of normalcy had been shattered. He would live with the weight of every decision, every deception, every act committed in pursuit of control. In the quiet aftermath, one truth remained clear. The attempt to protect a secret through crime or silence always demands a higher price than imagined. Responsibility, vigilance, and ethical courage are the only defenses against this inevitability. Marcus had failed. The lives he touched would bear the mark of that failure forever, and the lesson was as inescapable as the consequences themselves. Silence, he understood finally, was never neutral. It was never safe, and the cost it demanded was greater than any temporary relief could ever repay.